In the previous lesson, we looked at the process for assigning variable names or variable labels and value labels using the point and click approach, and specifically going through the variable view section of the data editor. In this lesson, we will continue to look at the process for assigning variable names and or variable labels and value labels, only we will look at a more efficient approach, which is the use of syntax. Now, in order to access a syntax window, simply go to your File menu. We want to open a new syntax window. Now, a syntax window in many respects is nothing more than a basic text editor. So it essentially is a process of understanding what commands to use in terms of how to generate the output and information that you want. Now, for our purpose, we're going to work with two basic commands. The first command is referred to as variable labels. The second command, as you might suspect, is value labels. Now, to begin, if we start with the variable labels command, and if you type slowly enough, then the software will actually attempt to try to identify what you are trying to type or what command you're actually wanting to enter. And so if we know the full command, certainly we can type out variable labels, the whole thing, or as it begins to give us ideas, we can simply locate it from the pop-up menu that we get, and so we can come down and select variable labels. Now, when we have identified our basic command as variable labels, there are two additional pieces of information that we have to provide. We have to identify the variable name, so we need to, in other words, tell the program, okay, go find the variable that I'm interested in labeling, and then we have to provide the label. So if, for example, we want to assign a label to the recruitment number 1 variable, which was the first column in our data set, we simply type in the variable name, in this case rec_1, and then in either single quotes or double quotes. And this is why I mentioned in the previous lesson with the I don't know, this is why we want to omit the apostrophes if we can, just because when we get over to the syntax, that apostrophe can occasionally end up causing complications. Now, at the same time, if you know you have a label that has an apostrophe in it or a single quote, then when we go to assign the labels, be sure to use the double quotes for your open and closing of your label. So in this case, we have variable labels. We've identified our variable name as rec1, and now we're going to assign the label. Now, in the previous lesson, we simply assigned the term because I like helping people. Now, one of the issues that arises is when we go to conduct an analysis, and we saw this when we conducted the frequency, is that the label gets used whenever we open up that dialog box, and that left-hand box contains all of the variables within our data set. Now, in some instances, it's actually a little easier to recognize our variables using the shorthand name rather than the long name. And so one suggestion when we begin to assign labels is to begin the label with the actual variable name. So, for example, in this situation, we could say our variable label will begin with rec_1, and then we simply type because I like helping people, and then we because we started with a single quote, we'll end with a double quote or a single quote. And then this concludes this command. And so we will simply put a period at the end, and then we can return to the next line. Now notice as we were typing, there was some back and forth between the text being coded in red, and then now we don't have any red. The red kind of is an indicator that there's a problem with the syntax, right? So once you finish a line and you go to the next line, if there's still red left in that line, that's an indicator that something's not quite right. Otherwise, the basic color coding that we see at this point, the actual SPSS commands, which in this case is the variable labels phrasing, that gets displayed in blue. So that tells you that that's the command, and then everything else basically represent the options or the specifications that accompany that command. And so at this point, if we wanted to actually apply this label, then we could simply do one of two things. We can highlight this section of syntax and then either click on the green play button, which will actually tell us that to run what we have selected, or we can come to the top menu bar, and under the run menu we can tell it what to run. In this case, we only want to run what's selected, or if we have a longer list of information, we could run the entire set of commands. But at this point, if we simply run the selection, again, notice our output window opens up, and it should tell us what we have run. And then when we come to our data set, notice our label, where before it was simply because I like helping people, now we have the REC in the beginning. And again, the practical application to this is that if we go to our Analyze menu and we go back to frequencies like we did previously, now we see from our data set, instead of starting with because I, we actually see the variable name, so we know, okay, these 7, and if we were to apply the labels to the remaining 6, we see that, okay, these 7 are going to be our recruitment questions, but then we also have the statement appended to the end of it. So it makes it a little bit easier to work with by putting that variable name at the beginning of our label. So that takes care of the syntax for assigning variable labels. Now, if we need to assign additional variable labels, there's different ways that this can be done. We can technically assign multiple labels by just using one command. At the same time, we can simply select the command. We can copy, go down to the next line and paste, and then go into our second variable, which is REC2, come over to our survey. We can do a copy, we will paste it, and again, notice the red kind of gives us an indication we have a problem, and we will put the closing quote and then end that with a period. And so now if we were to select and apply the second label, we can again return to our data editor, and we see that we've added our second label. Now again, notice in this particular instance we forgot to add the REC2 at the beginning. Because we're using syntax, this isn't a problem. We can simply return to our syntax editor, come in after our initial opening quote, add REC2. We will select this again, and in this case, even if we chose to run the entire set of programming, it's no big deal. It would just reassign the previous labels. But if we run this and again come back to our data editor. Now we've added the REC2. And so the one advantage that we're starting to see with the syntax is that it allows us to very easily go back and make an adjustment. But what we're also going to find as we progress through this is that the use of syntax will give us a running record of exactly what we've done and the exact process that we've gone through, what we've done to our data, how have we changed it, and so on. When we get into analyses, what steps did we go through? It gives you a record of that entire sequence. And of course, just like with the data file, once we get done with the syntax, we can go up and we can choose the save as option. And one of the notions, or one of the things to pay attention to when you are going to save a window, if you look at the save as type, the data window in SPSS is a .sav. The output is a .spv, and then the syntax is a .sps. And so if you remember those three file type endings, when you go to the save as and you just take a glance down, if you're planning to save or you're intending to save the syntax, we can see that, oh yes, we are indeed saving the syntax. If you were planning to save the output and you went down and you noticed that the file type is syntax, that tells you that even though you might see the output window in the background, in this case, for example, I have my syntax, but I can actually see the data editor in the background. If I'm intending to save the data, the fact that the file type is showing up as a syntax or SPS tells us the data window is not the active file. Okay, so these are just some little things to pay attention to, as you're working through and saving the files. So the variable labels, again, we would just continue to repeat that for each of our variables. Now, to assign our values, we will begin much the same way. We will start with value, and then it'll pop up. Our command is value labels. We want to identify the variable to which we want to assign these labels, and then we have to assign the labels themselves. And so the basic structure will be our command, the value to which we want to or the variable to which we want to assign values, and then we're going to identify the first value and then its label, the second value, the label, and the third value, and the label. All right. And again, because I'm using single quotes here, I took the apostrophe out of the I don't know. Again, if I wanted the apostrophe in there, then I could certainly leave that in. But notice if I do add that, I mentioned previously that the red indicates there's a problem. And essentially, if you think back to, for example, a mathematics course, essentially what this is saying is we've entered an open parentheses, but we didn't close it. And so as you look through, you can see we have a starting quote, an ending quote, a starting quote, an ending quote, a starting quote, and it's interpreting the apostrophe as the ending quote. And then we have this stuff in here that it doesn't know what to do with, but more importantly, it's treating this last quote as an open with no close. So again, if I wanted to keep the apostrophe, an alternative would be for the I don't know, I could come in and actually do a double quote. So again, single quotes and double quotes can be used interchangeably in the sense they're both used to set off that text string. The only important thing is they must match, right? And in this case, we can actually even use a combination, right? So again, if we have this, and then if we want to go to our second variable, we can simply highlight and copy. We'll paste, and we'll simply change the variable to variable 2. And so again, we can select both of these, run them, and if we go look at our data editor, notice we now have our value labels. And again, if we do click on the number 1, notice the I don't know has been changed to include the apostrophe. But then also, if we look at number 2, remember it did not have any values. All right, and so we can again use the syntax. And once you have the syntax once, then it simply becomes basically a copy and paste. Now, there are a few shortcuts if you have a situation where you have multiple values or multiple variables that have the same value assignment. All right. So, for example, if we take a look back at our survey, we notice, for instance, we have on let's see, on the training, notice we have 12 items for training. So what we could do is we could do the first one and then copy and paste, copy and paste, copy and paste, each time changing from training 1 to training 2 and so forth. What we can also do is, as a shortcut, we can use a slightly different notation, and we will still use value labels, but what we will do is say, I want you to begin with the variable training 1 and continue through training 12. Right? Now, the variable 1 to variable, the beginning to ending variable only works on a continuous run. All right. So train 1 to train 12 must be sequential in our data set. Right? If for some reason we had something stuck in between, so we had train 1 to train 6, and then we had some other variable, and then we had train 7 to 12, whatever that variable was that got stuck in the middle would be assigned these same values. All right. So this only works when we have a big block that runs consecutively that has the same attachment. And so at this point we had, for example, 4 was excellent, 3 I believe was good, 2 was fair, 1 was poor, and then we also had, looking at our code book, 88 was not offered and 99 was don't know. So we'll have 88 was not offered and 99, and I'm going to again use double quotes because I'm going to have the apostrophe as don't know. And then I close the quotes and I end the line with a period. Now if I highlight and run this command and I come back to my data editor, I can see that my 2 didn't work. So this kind of gives you an illustration where this was supposed to work, but in some instances it doesn't always want to work the way it's supposed to. And the issue actually is we only had 11 trainings. So let me go back real quick and change training to 11. And now if we look at our data editor, now you can see beginning with training 1 all the way down to training 11, it assigned all of them at one time. All right, so just make sure you know what the name of your first and your last variables are. So again, it's a little bit quicker, at the same time, you could very easily have just done training 1, assign the values, and then just simply done a copy and paste each time, changing it from train 1 to train 2 to train 3 and so on. It works just as well. And again, going back to what is the advantage of this syntax, in the grand scheme of things, if you have a kind of a comprehensive type analysis running, it gives you that ability to see, okay, I did this first, then I did this, then I did that, and so on. So you have that record of exactly what you did, which can definitely be a help if you get to a point where perhaps your results didn't come out the way you thought, or maybe they came out in such a way that it was very clear something went wrong. You can go back and try to find out, what happened. The other thing that happens, especially with the variable names and the value labels, is that this gives you essentially a backup to your code book, because all of these value label commands basically correspond to what you identified in your code book. So now, if for some reason you happen to lose your code book, then you would also have that same information over here in this SPSS file. So it can serve as a little bit of a backup to your code book. So at this point, you have two mechanisms for assigning the variable labels and value labels. You can go through the point and click, which definitely is going to be a much more drawn out process, or you can use the syntax, which number one is a more efficient approach, but number two, it also gives you the ability, if for some reason your data file got contaminated, you weren't able to open it, inadvertently got deleted, whatever, then you can always go back to that original Excel file, import it back in, and then simply open this syntax file up, tell it to run, and it will reassign all of the variable labels and all the value labels. Again, it can cut down your work, and especially if you create backups of all of this as well. So again, the syntax is definitely helpful, particularly as you get into larger and larger projects.